Hello again, and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Wednesday the 21st of December, the shortest day of the year. I'm Andrew Wilson, and this is Scotland at 7. I'm sorry we're starting a little bit late this evening. It's been a very busy day. This evening, I have the latest daily update from Ukraine on day 301 of the illegal Russian war of aggression and imperial ambition. Then I will introduce our guest for this evening, and then together we will discuss some of today's headlines from Scotland and around the world. Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived in the US, which is his first foreign trip since the war broke out 301 days ago. The US President Joe Biden released a statement saying that Zelensky will visit the White House today before addressing a joint session of Congress, demonstrating the strong bipartisan support for Ukraine. A senior US administration official denied that Biden will pressure Zelensky to seek a diplomatic end to the war. Zelensky's visit to the US is extremely significant and will disprove Russian attempts to show that the US-Ukrainian relations are cooling, Kyiv's presidential advisor Mikhailo Podolyak has said. The Ukrainian president's trip and meeting with his US counterpart will provide an opportunity to explain the real situation in Ukraine, what weapons Kyiv needs to fight Moscow, and why it needs them, Podolyak has told Reuters. The Kremlin has said that nothing good will come of Zelensky's trip to Washington and that Russia sees no chance of peace talks with Kyiv. In a call with reporters, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said that continued Western arms supplies to Ukraine would lead to a deepening of the conflict, something that could backfire on Kyiv, he warned. Air raid alerts were held across all parts of Ukraine on Wednesday, according to local officials. There was no immediate word of a new wave of Russian attacks. Russia's defense minister Sergei Shoigu has called for his country's military to be expanded from its current 1 million service personnel to 1.5 million amid the fighting in Ukraine. Speaking at an end-of-year conference with Russian military chiefs and President Putin, he also proposed raising the age range for mandatory Russian military service to cover Russian citizens aged 21 to 30. The former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev has undertaken a surprise trip to Beijing and held talks with the Chinese President Xi Jinping, during which they said that they discussed the Ukraine conflict. Medvedev, now deputy chair of Russia's Security Council, said he and President Xi had discussed the two countries' no-limit strategic partnership as well as Ukraine. The head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, Rafael Grossi, will visit Russia on Thursday for discussions on the creation of a security zone around the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant in southern Ukraine. That's according to the Russian state-owned RIA Novosti news agency. They were citing Russia's envoy to the international institutions based in Vienna. And a blast ripped through the Urengoy-Pomeroy-Uzhhorod gas-exporting pipeline that leads from Russia through Ukraine. Reuters reported that 3 people died in the incident. And the EU Foreign Policy Chief, Josep Borrell, yesterday condemned Iran's support for Russia in its war in Ukraine and the ongoing repression of opposition in the country, but said the EU would continue to work with Iran on restoring the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. Necessary meeting with Iranian Foreign Minister Hossein Amir-Abdollahian in Jordan amid deteriorating Iran-EU relations, Borrell tweeted ahead of a regional conference being hosted in Jordan. Now, we are lucky enough to be joined by a regular contributor to Broadcasting Scotland this evening. Linda Fabiani served as the SNP member of our Scottish Parliament, representing East Kilbride from 1999 until she retired at the Scottish election in 2021. When Linda retired, she was the Deputy Presiding Officer of the Parliament. Linda, good evening. How are you keeping?
Oh, I'm fine, Andrew, but lots of these little sniffles that people have got all the time at the moment.
Well, there certainly are, and I'm hoping you manage to get something that will help contend with the wee sniffles as soon as you get home this evening, and that you're not feeling too bad. For our first item this evening, we will stay with the war in Ukraine because President Volodymyr Zelensky has arrived in the US. and that's according to US officials. The Ukrainian president will meet with President Joe Biden and address Congress in his first foreign visit since the Russian invasion. The Ukrainian president arrived at the White House shortly after 2 p.m. local time today. He was greeted by the US President Joe Biden and the First Lady Jill Biden. As part of President Zelensky's visit to Ukraine, the US has announced $1.85 billion in additional military assistance for Ukraine, including Patriot air defense systems. The US Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, has announced a $1.85 billion additional military assistance for Ukraine, including the transfer of one Patriot air defense system. The assistance includes a $1 billion drawdown to provide Ukraine with expanded air defense and precision strike capabilities, and an additional £850 million in security assistance, Blinken said in a statement. The statement reads, "Pursuant to a delegation of authority from the US President, today I am authorizing our 28th drawdown of US arms and equipment for Ukraine since August 2021. This $1 billion drawdown will provide Ukraine with expanded air defense and precision strike capabilities, as well as additional munitions and critical equipment that Ukraine is using so effectively to defend itself on the battlefield." So, Linda, a couple of things to do with this story that's breaking this afternoon. Firstly, how significant do you think it is that President Volodymyr Zelensky has left Ukraine for the first time since the war began?
Yeah, well, I do think it's significant, Andrew. We're nearly a year in. It's absolutely horrendous, day 301, as you said. So I think he has to be in America to show the rest of the world that Ukraine has to win in this, and Russia cannot be allowed to run riot through Ukraine and indeed surrounding countries, because that's the bigger picture here. I believe quite strongly that Ukraine is probably only the start of it. I do worry a bit though. When I heard that Zelensky was leaving Ukraine, I just worry about his personal safety when he's, on the other side of the world and when he's in different places. So I'm sure he's got the best security possible. I'm sure he doesn't want to be away from Ukraine. I think his actions over the last 10 months would show that. But he feels it's necessary. And America, like it or not, leads the way, if you like. America and the EU. So there's a big message going out there by him being so welcomed when he got to the US.
Thanks, Linda. That's a number of very good points that you're making. I'm pretty sure the photograph I saw showed that President Zelensky had been transported to the US by the US Air Force. He stepped off a US presidential jet. So I think they are, one, very well protected, and two, people would think twice about doing anything foolish that's got the United States of America written up the side. But thinking a little bit more broadly about one of the things that's happening in Washington today, for folks who are perhaps by nature more driven by political means to end conflict, and who don't perhaps necessarily see conflict as being the way of resolving political issues. On the one hand, this is an extra $1.85 billion in military hardware that is being offered by the Americans, and in particular, the first time that a Patriot air defense system is being made available. As I understand it, Patriot systems are, one, very expensive, two, very complicated, and three, involve an awful lot of people to make them work. So do you think that the provision of this amount of this value of equipment, and particularly this Patriot system, is it going to, if you like, escalate, or to use Putin's word, is it going to deepen the conflict, or is it simply a necessary step in protecting civilians who are being killed by the Russians?
Well, I think we even have to take a step back from that and say, is there any possibility at all that Russia would be open to stopping this aggression and this land grab in Ukraine? I don't think there is. I think that there are talks going on in the background all the time. There's intelligence between and amongst nations going on all the time. So it would seem to me that Russia is bent on a particular course of action and that there's no diplomatic possibility of talks, despite the Russian propaganda that comes out. So I think it's probably a necessary step. Yes, protecting civilians because the deaths have been horrendous, but also to be stopping any further aggression, if at all possible. So, as I say, we're not party to all the information, all the intelligence that is out there. Pacifism, I mean, I hate war, I absolutely hate it, but I'm not a pacifist in its true sense of the word because I just feel that every nation has the right to defend itself and to fight against, external aggression, and indeed citizens have the right to fight against internal oppression as well. So, sadly, I think there's probably no alternative than for the Western allies to use the phrase and neighbouring countries of Ukraine to meet aggression with defence.
As you say, Linda, the right to self-defence, both of nations and of individuals, is pretty much inalienable, and in certain circumstances, in the face of aggression, there's only one thing to do. Disappointing and depressing though it is. But thank you, Linda. That's some great insight. I'm very grateful to you. We'll come back to Scotland now for our next item this evening, because Scottish nurses, paramedics and midwives are now threatening a wave of strikes early next year, after heavily rejecting the pay offer from Scottish ministers in Edinburgh. The Royal College of Nursing and Royal College of Midwives announced on Wednesday that their members had voted overwhelmingly against the offer and were considering when to stage nationwide strike action. Their votes, which follow a similar rejection by Scottish paramedics and hospital workers in the GMB last week, will put the First Minister's government under intense pressure to resume pay talks. It could also set back hopes of an NHS pay deal in the rest of the UK. Union leaders have privately hoped a Scottish settlement, worth about 7.5% in average, could be used to pressure ministers in London to match Scotland's offer. Scotland's health unions are due to meet tomorrow morning to discuss a joint strategy before they meet the Scottish Health Secretary Humza Yousaf and government officials to press their case for further pay talks later in the day. Julie Lamberth, the board chair of RCN Scotland, 82% of whose members rejected the offer, said the result could not be clearer. We have forcefully rejected what the Scottish Government said is its best and final offer. The ball is in the Scottish Government's court if strike action is going to be avoided. Unlike the UK Government's proposal of a £1,400 increase in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, Scottish ministers had tabled a revised deal last month offering all NHS staff in Scotland a tiered pay rise worth up to 11.24% for the lowest paid, 7.5% for the majority, and about 2% for the highest paid, along with reduced working hours. Scottish nurses and midwives did not take part in the hospital strikes across the rest of the UK today because their industrial action was suspended whilst they consider the offer from the Scottish Government. So, Linda, events moving quickly both north and south of the border today, with strike action across the NHS in England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and a rejection, a pretty strong rejection of the current pay offer from the Scottish ministers to the Royal College of Nursing and to the Royal College of Nursing in Scotland. So do you think, is there really a contrast between the way in which the industrial action is unfolding in the NHS that's not in Scotland and in our Scottish NHS? Or are we going to see a coming together of issues with strikes starting to spread across the whole UK?
Well, it'll be interesting to see what happens after the joint discussions from all the relevant unions across the UK. But I think there has already been, Andrew, an acceptance across the UK at union level that there's very different behaviours going on in the two governments. The Scottish Government has always been willing to meet, sit round and discuss The Westminster government has just gone for complete standoff. To me, that shows two very, very different ways of looking at our National Health Service. In Scotland, the Scottish Government has been very, very clear. The National Health Service is sacrosanct as far as they're concerned, and they will do everything to keep a very public National Health Service in Scotland. I think when you look south of the border at the actions of UK government ministers, and indeed some of the press that I have seen, front pages in the Daily Mail Express, etc., are just vile. But they're being encouraged by UK government ministers. I actually believe, and I've thought about this a lot, I believe that the UK government actually is encouraging strike action, because I believe that their longer term goal is privatisation of many health services. I think the establishment down there in London is deliberately baiting the trade unions and trying to convince the general populace, along, as I said, with the right-wing press, that these are greedy people and that they shouldn't be striking at all. I think their philosophy is if you can turn the public against public servants, then it is far easier for you to carry out what you want to do, which is privatisation of these services. So there's a fundamental difference. Got to keep talking. I'm glad that Hamza Yousaf, the responsible cabinet secretary, is showing respect to the trade unions, to the individual workers by carrying on discussing. My concern is that there's just not much else that can be done because the Scottish Government is strapped for cash. I think that's very plain. Ergo, there should be ongoing discussions between the Scottish Government and the Westminster Government and the unions, all of them, to get this sorted out, because people's lives are at risk here. People's well-being and health are at risk. And it is not the ambulance drivers, not the nurses, not the medical professionals who are putting people's lives at risk, despite some of the reports in leading newspapers. It is the UK government which is putting people's lives at risk. And I just think it's despicable behaviour. They should take a leaf out the Scottish Government's book. I can't talk for the Welsh Government in this, or indeed the Northern Ireland ministers that are there, because I'm not knowledgeable enough to know what they're doing. But I know that the actions of the UK government are absolutely abhorrent.
Thank you, Linda. I mean, your point about goading the trade unions and the workers is, I think, bears some weight today. We've had Steve Barclay, the English Health Secretary, accusing, in the pages of the Daily Telegraph, accusing the ambulance drivers in England and Wales of deliberately choosing to harm patients, which I think has struck everybody as being a comment that is deliberately intended to inflame the situation. But the point about respect that you also make, I think, it bears examining. You were talking there about the Scottish Government giving due respect to key frontline NHS workers and their trade unions, and giving them the courtesy and the respect of listening to them, something which the Health Secretary in England and Wales has point blank refused to do. And there's an element there also of respect of citizens who rely on the NHS. Is it fair to say that it appears that the Westminster government feels that it can play politics, as you say, with people's lives? It can play politics with key frontline emergency services simply in order to either save money or to make a political point about trying to break another trade union?
Yeah, I think there's all of that, but I also think there's a longer term objective, and look at the mess the Tories have been in over the last few years, and then there was Boris, then there was Liz Truss, and now there's Rishi Sunak, and everybody breathed a sigh of relief. But Rishi Sunak's not any different. They're all in the same camp. They're a new breed of Tory for whom public services are anathema, because they think the market should rule everything and prevail. And if there are necessary casualties in that, I think they're quite willing just to let that happen.
Thank you, Linda. And we'll continue to look at industrial relations. You and I are both, I think, old enough to remember when industrial relations were given front and centre stage in a great deal of news reporting. And to be fair, workers and their elected and their appointed representatives were also given airtime and were given the opportunity to put forward their case, something that we've maybe not seen very much of for the last 20, 30 years, perhaps. So we'll continue to. So we'll continue to look at industrial relations, because the First Minister and the STUC have urged all parties to get round the negotiating table to end disruption in the railways. The UK government has been urged to act to end the long-running dispute over pay and conditions on the railways that continues to disrupt services in Scotland. The First Minister and the STUC called on all parties involved in the dispute to come together to seek resolution. The First Minister said, "The Scottish Government has maintained constructive discussions with the trade unions and has settled our own pay negotiations by embracing the concept of fair work." Despite this, passengers in Scotland still face severe disruption as a direct result of the ongoing UK-wide rail dispute between Network Rail, UK government rail operators, and the trades unions, and Network Rail employees in Scotland face entering the new year still with no pay rise. The First Minister continued, "The repercussions of this dispute and the UK government's refusal to engage constructively with trade unions are continuing to have a major impact not only for the rail workers, but for passengers, freight, businesses and the wider public in Scotland over the festive period and into 2023. The Secretary of State for Transport must intervene immediately and work with the trade unions to secure a railway that benefits users, staff and the wider public." So, Linda, it strikes me that that statement from the First Minister underlines the point you've just been making, but in respect of a separate set of industrial disputes in a separate industry, and in an industry where the Scottish components were settled some time ago, but because of the approach that the Westminster government is taking, we're seeing both workers working for Network Rail and passengers are seeing their services disrupted. And it struck me that, notwithstanding what you and I have just been discussing, the different approach that the two governments take, I wonder if it also indicates a different approach that the two governments are taking to net zero, to the green economy, and to a just transition. I think it would be fair to say that the Scottish government has demonstrated a commitment to rail travel, taking ScotRail back into public ownership, announcing in the budget announcement the plan to fund peak time travel, so the cost of peak travel comes down to the same as off-peak travel, and also trialling hydrogen-powered trains. I cannot for the life of me remember exactly where. It might have been Bowness, I can't remember. Anyway, trialling hydrogen-powered trains in order to move trains to being completely green, even although they are probably the greenest way of travelling under motive power as there is. Do you think, is that in addition to industrial policy, or industrial relations policy, does this indicate another divergence between Westminster and Holyrood and between England and Scotland in terms of fairly basic fundamental policies?
Absolutely. There's always other elements in everything we discuss, Andrew. And again, just to say, they're treating the rail unions exactly the same way as they're treating the health unions. They're refusing to talk. They're changing, they're moving the goalposts at the very last minute, and then vilifying the union leaders when deals aren't accepted. And again, you have a right-wing press that comes right in the back of that. And the media too. Some of the things that have been said about the rail leaders, the man's name escapes me at the moment, but there's the trade union leader who has been absolutely brilliant. Mick Lynch, is it? Mr. Lynch, who's been putting the case forward and telling the truth, and, laying bare the lies that have been told by the UK government. And as a result, he has been vilified by social commentators by the Tory party. I mean, I saw some social media stuff from the Conservative Party that was appalling. And again, it's about making them the villains. And you said a wee while ago that you and I go back long enough, and we certainly do, to remember all this before. And it's starting to all sound very familiar. You know, the phrases are all starting to come out. Trade unions holding the country to ransom. Remember the winter of discontent, for example. All these things are being said again. It's about smashing the unions. It's about taking away the rights of workers and about privatising everything under the sun and leaving it to the market where possible. And again, the bigger picture, if you look at the employment laws and things that we're likely to lose as a result of Brexit, it's a very, very sad picture. And yes, there is, to use the phrase, a tale of two governments. You have a Scottish government which is committed to the Fair Work principle and the just transition. The UK government, I don't believe, is committed to any of these things at all. They're committed to looking after their own and making life pretty good for themselves. And that sounds very, very simplistic. But actually, I think what they want to do is pretty simplistic. It's as straightforward as that. It's look after what they see as their own. And I think everything they have done over the last few years would point in that direction. So yes, it's very, very sad though that the people in England are suffering because of this. What I also think is very, very sad is that there are no mainstream journalists and very few media people out there that are showing very clearly in Scotland what the differences are in what's happening. But I also think it's very, very sad that they are not reporting on the differences in England so that English people can see that they're being fed a lot of lies and a lot of propaganda and that things could actually be better. And I keep hoping that at some point there will be such a recognition in England that they're being taken for mugs and being used as pawns in this game of the UK Conservative government, that they will what? Just start to see it, Andrew, and just start to say enough is enough. We're not putting up with this anymore. There's a few voices out there, but there are not nearly enough. And that leads me on to independence. An independent Scotland would be taken note of. So an independent Scotland would be something that would be good for Scotland, but it would also be good for the other nations that currently make up the UK.
Thank you, Linda. I think that's a point very well made. On top of a number of points in connection with the behaviour of the government south of the border, in particular, and the determination of the government north of the border, it seems, to protect people both in the short term and in the longer term. But I'd like to look for a moment now at the cost of living crisis and one aspect of the cost of living crisis relating to energy costs, because the Westminster government has committed to provide up to £4.5 billion to fund the takeover of the collapsed energy company Bulb by its rival Octopus. Bulb spent more than a year in a state-handled administration, and its 1.5 million customers were transferred to Octopus on Tuesday night. The Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy said the cost could be up to £4.5 billion to fund Bulb's operations under Octopus ownership until the end of March, depending on the movement of energy prices. The government said it would also provide the company with a cash injection and cover any compensation that may occur as a result of Bulb's actions prior to the transfer. This support is on top of the £1.1 billion already paid to handle Bulb's administration. This is expected to rise because of the wind-down costs for the administrator appointed, a company called Teneo. The Office for Budget Responsibility, the independently run government-backed forecaster, has previously said that the costs of the Bulb collapse could reach £6.5 billion for the Treasury. However, a government spokesman said the OBR figure did not reflect the true cost of Bulb, as the terms of the deal and financial support due to eventually be repaid by Octopus were not included in the watchdog's estimates. We still expect the net cost to taxpayers to be much lower, said the spokesperson. The figures come amid an intense row between politicians, ministers, and rival suppliers over the cost of bailing out Bulb and the deal between the government and Octopus. Bulb was founded in 2015 by the entrepreneurs Amit Gupta and Hayden Wood with the intention of challenging the dominance of the energy industry's legacy supply firms, but like others was caught out by a sharp rise in wholesale energy prices last year. Rivals have said that Bulb represents a mess-up worth billions. British Gas, Scottish Power and E.ON challenged the deal, and a court allowed Bulb's customers to be transferred, but a judicial review which could cause the deal yet to be unpicked is expected to be heard in court in London in late February. Suppliers, my apologies. In an extract from a statement made by the Octopus Chief Financial Officer Stuart Jackson to the court, he said that based on Octopus's calculation, the cost of energy was estimated at approximately £2.4 billion, and the amount to be repaid is estimated at approximately £2.7 billion. So, Linda, in general terms, the numbers I'm talking about there sound stupendous to me. The amounts of money that are changing hands and the money's ending up somewhere. Does it sound in any way an appropriate way to maintain energy supplies to people's houses by handing over billions of pounds to other energy companies?
I'm just a bit lost in all of this, Andrew, I have to say. I read a wee bit about it fairly recently, but I'm not completely up to date on what's been going on with it. You know, the fact that the OBR, the Office for Borrowing Responsibility, has had issues with it, I think is very telling. Because what this Conservative government have been doing is ignoring all these forecasts, ignoring all the advice that's been given, and they just fire ahead and do what they will. Now, I don't understand why this particular company has to be in receipt of billions and billions of pounds. I mean, I think the name Octopus is probably quite telling. It's just grabbing everything in, and it just sums up the UK government and their cronies as far as I'm concerned. I think there'll be an awful lot more to come out in the wash with this. Certainly a judicial review will flush some of that out. But they will put it down to necessity due to rising energy prices, due to the war in Ukraine. They'll probably pull in the pandemic as well, because that's what they do. They justify everything by this. But one thing's for sure, I bet the two fellas that started it up aren't going to food banks. And I bet all the investors that were part of it won't be going to food banks. And I think you can bet your bottom dollar that an awful lot of the people that were in at the start will still be there in the new setup. And I would be interested to see who they all are.
Thanks, Linda. I think there's this, with the court still being involved and the amount of money involved, I suspect this story is going to run for some considerable time longer. So I suspect that you and I will be discussing it at least once more in the future. But we'll come back to Scotland now for a little bit of politics, because the Labour former cabinet minister, Douglas Alexander, is understood to be trying to stand again as an MP at the next election, in what some are saying is the latest sign of Labour big beasts returning to frontline politics. Sources confirmed to The Guardian that Alexander, who has held 3 cabinet posts under Prime Ministers Blair and Brown, had submitted his application to be the party's candidate in East Lothian. You'll remember, Linda, that Alexander dramatically lost his Paisley and Renfrewshire seat to Barry Black in 2015, when Labour was left with only one MP in Scotland, and since then he's been a senior fellow at Harvard University. It's suggested that other senior big beasts are thinking of returning to politics. He's proposing to stand in East Lothian, which is, of course, Labour's #1 target seat in Scotland, and was held by the party until the landslide in 2015, then briefly won back in 2017 and 19, with Labour insiders describing it as, on paper, the most easily winnable seat for us in Scotland. The seat is, of course, currently held by the Alba Party's Kenny McCaskill, who was elected in 2019 for the SNP with a majority of 3,886. So, Linda, I'm interested to get your reflections on this story, given that you were around in 2015 and you will
Aye,
know a number of the characters involved in this.
yeah.
Firstly, Douglas Alexander's name is at the top of the story. What do you think of the prospects for his successful return to frontline Scottish politics in Scotland?
Well, it might happen. But, I find it really difficult to understand from two aspects. First of all, I don't actually understand why Douglas Alexander, on a personal level, would want to come back like that, because we're all told how successful he is and how well he's doing and everything else. Why would want to return to uh, which you would hope would be frontline politics, which wouldn't necessarily be? I don't know. So I find that quite strange. On the other level, for the Labour Party in Scotland, I find it just smacks of desperation, because if they're talking about bringing what they call the big beasts, and it's a terrible expression they use, awful. So at time politics had fewer of these so-called big beasts, because they haven't exactly made a great success of it down in Westminster, have they? Um, it smacks of desperation. Do they not have any new talent? You know, when you look at an awful lot of the Labour Party these days, they go from one parliament to another parliament, and then they go to be a councillor, and then they try to come back to parliament again. I'm just like, going to get a life. I mean, do something else. I mean, contribute some other way. There's loads and loads of ways that people can contribute to society. It doesn't have to be in the parliament. So when I think even of my own party, the SNP, I mean, there's all this wonderful talent coming through, young women, young men who are eager to make a difference in their country. And of course, the SNP, they're fighting for independence. And I think I would find it very, very hard to even get a thought of going back, because there's all these wonderful new people there. So, desperation on behalf of the Labour Party, if you ask me. And I'll tell you what will really put the nail in the coffin of them would be if Gordon Brown suddenly decides he's going to come back or something. That would be really desperate. So we'll wait and see. We'll have a look at it with interest.
We're waiting with bated breath for the return of Gordon Brown. Heavens above. The satirical stories are writing themselves as we speak. But let's move on from looking at what's left of the Labour Party, of the British Labour Party in Scotland, because for our final item this evening, Scottish ministers have reached an agreement with social landlords on below-inflation rent increases for the next financial year. Organisations representing social landlords have announced their members' plans for average rent increases for 23-24, which will keep rents significantly below private market levels. Under the Cost of Living Tenant Protection Act 2022, rents are effectively frozen in the social rented sectors until March 23. Decisions on future plans for the private sector rent freezes, as well as other measures contained in the Act, will be announced in coming weeks. The Tenants' Rights Minister, Patrick Harvie, said, "Our emergency legislation has given people, whether they rent in the private or social rented sectors, reassurance within their current tenancies through the worst of the winter, even as their other costs have been rising. We recognise the enormous pressures households are facing, and by making this announcement now, we aim to give social tenants advance notice and confidence that any rent increase will be well below inflation." So, Linda, is this an
Mm.
indication again of the Scottish Government interacting and interceding in a market in order to attempt to protect those who are least able to protect themselves? And that's in sharp contrast to the lack of attention being paid in Westminster.
I mean, I certainly think there's an element of that. But I would say, what we're saying here is much more in relation to the private market, where they feel they have to
Mhm.
protect people, because regardless of political colour of our local authorities, I would say that genuinely, when it comes to social housing, they do their best to try and protect people. And certainly, housing associations under the auspices of the Scottish Federation of Housing Associations and Glasgow and West of Scotland Forum of Housing Associations, they have to consult their tenants every year. on proposed rent increases and things. So I think there is a joint social conscience, if you like, from government, from local authorities, and from social landlords in Scotland generally, that will do their best for people. A recognition that, with some exceptions, of course, but they are generally providing a service to the most needy people in the country. Sadly, that's the way social housing is going. I don't believe it should be that way, but that's what successive Westminster governments have created in social housing, even in Scotland. So I think it's good news. I think it's great that the Scottish Government talks with everyone. But I also think it's great that local authorities and housing associations have risen to the challenge and that they have all jointly reached an agreement in this. So yes, good news. And there's other parts of the UK that could take a leaf out of their book.
Thank you, Linda. I knew that you would have a particular insight into that item, given your own background. So thank you. I'm very grateful to you for that. And of course, there are still debates going on, and there is more work to be done as we come out of the winter, and as the continuing damage to the private and social rent, to the private and particularly the social rented sector, are properly understood. So I'm sure that you and I will be discussing this story again very soon. But I'm afraid that's all that we have time for this evening. In making these programmes, Broadcasting Scotland relies on the support of viewers and others who value our distinctive approach to news, current affairs and culture. Please help us to continue to make these programmes, to continue to develop the station, and to make new programmes. Our programmes will always be free to view, but if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. We have had to set ourselves a target of raising £30,000 from Broadcasting Scotland supporters in order to continue to pay the bills and to continue to make programmes. To everyone who has already donated, and to everyone who has already signed up to make a regular monthly payment as a Broadcasting Scotland supporter, thank you very much. There are other ways in which you can contribute to our work. If you would like to volunteer to work with Broadcasting Scotland, behind the scenes or in front of the cameras, then please visit our website at www.broadcastingscotland.scot and send us a message there. You can find us on Twitter at BroadcastScot, and you can find us on Facebook by searching for Broadcasting Scotland. When you're watching us on YouTube, it would be great if you would like and subscribe to Broadcasting Scotland on that platform. Please click on the little bell. Now, we will be back again tomorrow evening at 7 with the next edition of Scotland at 7, so please come back and join us then. I'd like to thank everyone who's been watching this evening, and of course, I'd like to give a very special thanks to our very special guest, Linda Fabiani. Linda, thank you very much for joining us this evening. On this day in 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 was en route from London to New York, but was destroyed over Lockerbie, killing all 243 passengers, 16 crew on board, and 11 people on the ground in the town. After 34 years, the Libyan intelligence official accused of making the bomb that brought down the aircraft has been taken into custody and will face federal charges in Washington. Our thoughts, meanwhile, are with all of the families of those who lost their lives on that day. I hope that you have a very peaceful evening. Bye-bye.